This right here is the Microsoft Xbox. Time to review it. Picture this for a second. The year is 2001. It's 1 year into the turn of the century. Sony's PlayStation 2 is 1 year into its lifespan and is selling like hotcakes. Sega is getting ready to discontinue the struggling Dreamcast after only 2 years on the market. And Nintendo is getting ready to debut their brand new Nintendo GameCube console. The last thing anybody expected was Microsoft to throw their hat in the ring. Besides working closely with Sega to incorporate Windows CE technology in the Dreamcast, Microsoft really had no experience in the console realm. And yet, they decided to make a console of their own. Saying that this was a surprise to everybody was an understatement. And so, in late 2001, Microsoft gave us the Xbox. Originally codenamed the DirectXbox in development due to the system using Microsoft's very own DirectX API, the Xbox was the most powerful console of its generation, thanks to being based off of PC architecture, making it very easy for developers to make games for it, and even easier to port games from PC to console. Microsoft made sure to go all out on the Xbox, including revealing the damn console itself, by having Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson up on stage with Bill Gates when revealing the Xbox.
And what The Rock is to sports entertainment, to the WWF, the Xbox will be to the video game industry a breakthrough and certainly an original. And considering that this Xbox at this moment is only running on 1/5 of the system's power, it's very impressive. Bill, do you have any idea what The Rock would be like if he were only running on 1/5 of his power?
Well, I would think that...
It doesn't matter what you think, Bill.
Yeah, the 2000s was a wild time. And it didn't stop there. Microsoft was very forward-thinking with the Xbox. It had a built-in hard drive. It had a built-in broadband modem. And hell, it even had high-definition resolution support, all the way up to 720p or 1080i. In 2001, mind you. That is insane. The Xbox ended up selling about 24 million units worldwide throughout its entire lifespan between 2001 and 2008. Now that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but considering that this is Microsoft's very first console, that's not too bad. It may not have beaten the PS2 in terms of sales, but it helped establish the Xbox brand and made it what it is today. And that's the most important thing. Anybody who's met me knows that I'm a very late adopter when it comes to consoles, and the Xbox is no exception. I didn't get my own until about 2015, so pretty late to the party. I believe this specific Xbox was manufactured sometime in 2004, and it's still trucking along perfectly fine. I got an Xbox mainly because most of the multi-platform games look and play a little better on Xbox compared to PS2 and GameCube. That, and of course, the amazing exclusives that the Xbox has. This thing has great exclusives. So let's take a closer look at this thing, shall we? So, right off the bat, compared to the PS2 and GameCube, the Xbox is massive. It's quite heavy for a console, too. You'll need a forklift to lift this bad boy. Well, the reason why the Xbox is so big and so heavy is because this thing has a straight-up desktop size hard drive and DVD drive. So in order to fit those components in there, Microsoft had to make the Xbox as big as it is. And unlike the PS2, the Xbox never got a second model that shrunk things down, unfortunately. So this is literally the only version of the console. Big and girthy. I am curious what an Xbox Slim version would look like. I think that'd be pretty cool. For the longest time, the Xbox took the cake as being one of the biggest consoles ever. Well, of course, until PlayStation 5 came out. On the front of the system, we have our DVD drive with the Xbox logo there, which is a nice touch. We also have 4 controller ports, which, unlike the PS2, the Xbox had 4 controller support right out of the box, which was awesome. We will also find the eject and power buttons, which, unlike the Xbox 360, the power ring is actually around the eject button on the original Xbox. Kinda odd, but it is what it is. And you may not be able to see it very well on camera, but at the way far right of the console, we have a compact disc Dolby Digital and Microsoft logo. On top of the system we'll find the Xbox logo as well as a gigantic X. It gives the Xbox a really cool look. I really like this. And of course we've got these cool looking grooves on each side of the gigantic X. Just like the PS2, these tend to collect dust, and that's the only thing I really don't like about it. It's kind of hard to keep clean. Also, the Xbox is not actually black, despite how it looks on camera. If you look really closely, you may be able to see that it's actually a really, really dark tint of green. That's a really nice touch. On the left side of the Xbox, there's air intake vents. And of course, on the right side, the same thing. On the bottom of the system, we'll find 2 more air intake vents, as well as warnings, FCC nonsense, as well as the manufacture date. Which, this specific Xbox was manufactured on November 23rd, 2004. On the back of the Xbox, we'll find AC power, a cooling fan, which is a little noisy, but at least it's not as noisy as my PS2. That thing is loud. We also have our AV out and an Ethernet jack, because as I said earlier in the video, the Xbox is the very first system to ever have broadband internet built in. This port was used for connecting multiple Xboxes together for system linking, as well as playing online with other Xbox users. Unfortunately, Microsoft shut down Xbox Live for the original Xbox back in 2010, so there's no way to play online anymore. Unless, of course, you use tunneling software and or mod your Xbox. Let's move on to talking about the controller, and here it is. Although, this is not the original controller that shipped with the Xbox, at least not here in North America. This right here is known as the S controller. This originally shipped with the Xbox in Japan because the controller that we got in the States was, well, let's just say it fit the Xbox's theme of being big and bulky, and people hated it. So later on, I think around 2002 or 2003, they brought the S controller to the States as well as Europe, and I really like this controller. It's not my favorite controller in the world. It definitely has its flaws. The D-pad is okay, and the placement of the black and white and start and back buttons is a little odd, but honestly, it doesn't bother me all that much. I do like the controller. It's a good controller, what can I say? Also, just like the console itself, the Xbox controller is also a really dark tint of green. And so is the cable. Microsoft took a lot of inspiration from the Dreamcast for the Xbox, including incorporating memory card slots on the controller itself, just like the Sega Dreamcast. This memory card I have here is a Mad Catz branded one, and I believe it's 8 megabytes in capacity. And it wasn't just memory cards that these slots were used for. They were also used for the chat headsets for Xbox Live. Also, do you want to know the coolest thing about the Xbox controller? The breakaway cable. This thing is awesome. This has saved my ass many, many times in the past. It's like Microsoft knew that people were going to trip over the cable and yank the console onto the floor. Well, thanks to the breakaway cable, this stays attached to the console while this breaks away from the connector. It is awesome. Genius. Absolute genius. I believe the breakaway cable was also used on the Xbox 360 wired controllers as well. I'm sure you're all dying to know why the Xbox was the most powerful console of this generation. Well, for starters, for a CPU it uses a custom Intel Pentium 3 Coppermine based CPU clocked at 733 megahertz. For memory, it uses 64 megabytes of DDR SD RAM clocked at 200 megahertz. For storage, you can either use the 8 or 10 gigabyte internal hard drive on the Xbox, or the aforementioned optional 8 megabyte memory cards. For a graphics chip, it uses an NVIDIA GeForce 3 based NV2A GPU clocked at 233 megahertz. The Xbox supports DVD and CD disc formats. For connectivity, it uses a 100 megabit Ethernet port for either system linking or online play. For audio, the Xbox supports mono, stereo, Dolby Surround, Dolby Digital Live 5.1, and DTS surround sound. For AV output, the Xbox supports composite, S-Video, component video, and SCART. For video resolution, the Xbox supports 480i, 480p, 720p, and 1080i. And finally, the Xbox measures in at 12.5 by 4 by 10.5 inches and weighs a girthy 8.5 pounds. Wow. All right, let's talk about my game collection for the Xbox. And I have a decent amount in my library. The Xbox is getting old enough to where game prices are starting to go up a little bit, but nowhere near as insane as GameCube prices. Those are out of control right now. Luckily, game prices have only been going up on certain titles in the Xbox library. Most of its games are fairly cheap nowadays. Not as cheap as PS2, but certainly not as expensive as GameCube. I do think that the original Xbox backwards compatibility program on Xbox One and Xbox Series X has certainly helped keep prices down on games, but if it wasn't for that program, I definitely think that Xbox game prices would be a lot higher now. So first up, we have Conquer Live and Reloaded. This is a fantastic remake of Conquer's Bad Fur Day on the Nintendo 64. It added better controls, new voice lines, better graphics, and of course, online multiplayer. This remake is pretty frowned upon by fans of the original game because they did censor some parts of this game that were uncensored on the original Nintendo 64 version, but honestly, I don't mind it all that much. It's a minor gripe, but I do think that this game plays a lot better than the original Nintendo 64 version. If you're a fan of the original, then just play the rare replay on Xbox One, but this is by far the best way to play Conquer's Bad Fur Day, in my opinion. This game is not for the faint of heart, in case you couldn't tell by the warning label right there. And also, this title can be a little spendy nowadays. I was lucky to get mine cheap because the box art was kind of torn up. I believe I paid about 20 bucks for this one, but this game can be easily more expensive than that. Just keep that in mind. You can't talk about any Xbox console without mentioning Halo. And this is where it all started, on the original Xbox. What can I say that hasn't been said already? Halo is legendary. Even though this game is 20 years old as of 2021, it is aged remarkably well and is still played by many people today. I loved Halo when I first played it. It is one of my favorite first-person shooters. I still find myself coming back to the original every so often. Whether you play the original on PC or Xbox, or if you play the anniversary version on Xbox 360 or Xbox One, you're going to have a great time. And they improved so much of this game in the following sequels. And speaking of the sequel, here it is. Halo 2 is everything that Halo 1 was, but so much better. This game is simply a masterpiece, except for the ending. I won't spoil it, but it's disappointing. But the rest of the game is fantastic. The graphics in this game are superb. By far the best on the original Xbox. This game pushes the system to its absolute limits. This game looks almost as good as early Xbox 360 games. Plus, they added online multiplayer to Halo 2. If you're a fan of first-person shooters, you have to play Halo 2. It is a must-play for anybody. Mercenaries Playground Destruction. This is a great game. It's made by the same developers who made the Star Wars Battlefront series. The graphics are great, gameplay is great, voice acting is great. It's overall a great game. I definitely recommend the Xbox version because the PS2 version, it doesn't look as good and the frame rate can be absolutely terrible in the PS2 version. So this is the version to get. Plus, I believe it's backwards compatible on Xbox One. So all the more reasons to play it. Ford Mustang: The Legend Lives. This is actually a pretty decent racing game. Tons of cars to drive, a decent selection of tracks to race on. It's a pretty good game. It's not the best racing game in the world, but it's a decent one. And if you're a Ford Mustang fan, you've got the perfect game. I love me some 80s and 90s arcade games, and Midway made some of the best ones. Midway Arcade Treasures includes 20 classic arcade games like Gauntlet, Defender, Joust, Spy Hunter, and many, many more. This is simply a great arcade compilation. I highly recommend it. Max Payne. This game was a huge deal when it first released in 2001. The graphics may not have aged very well 20 years later, but the gameplay certainly has aged fairly well, and that's the most important thing. This game is still a blast to play 20 years later. Plus, the Xbox version runs at a buttery smooth 60 FPS, making it way better than the PS2 version. I highly recommend playing through Max Payne at least once. It's a pretty great game. Outrun 2. This is a sequel to the fantastic Outrun game from the arcade, and this is a great sequel. Great graphics, online multiplayer, and a buttery smooth 60 FPS. This is a fantastic arcade game. This is a must-have for any Xbox owner. Virtual Pool Tournament Edition. It's an okay pool game. There's nothing really special about it. The only reason why I picked up this game is because it runs at 720p, and it actually looks pretty decent. But other than that, it's a pool game and it's okay. That's all I can really say about it. Need for Speed Most Wanted. This is a fantastic Need for Speed game. One of the best in the series in my opinion. The graphics are great, there's plenty of cars to drive, it has a fantastic soundtrack, and of course you can't forget those awesome police chases. Those were so much fun. Unfortunately, this game is pretty infamous for having really bad rubber banding AI, but other than that, it is a fantastic Need for Speed game. If you want the best gameplay on console, I highly recommend either the Xbox or Xbox 360 version. And finally, we have Namco Museum. I love Namco arcade games. They are some of my favorites. And this was the first Namco Museum game to come out on 6th generation consoles. It includes many classics such as Pac-Man, Miss Pac-Man, Pole Position, Galaga, as well as a few arrangement arcade games that came out in the 90s such as Pac-Man Arrangement, Dig Dug Arrangement, and Galaga Arrangement. If you love Namco arcade games as much as I do, this is a no-brainer. What time is it? Well, technically it's 2:30 in the afternoon, but I wasn't going to say that. What I was going to say is, it's time to show this thing in action. Alright, we got everything all plugged in and ready to go. And of course I'm using component cables to get the best possible output. Here we go. Oh, I love that startup. It's so freaking cool, man. So in terms of fan noise, the Xbox, well, rather, my Xbox is surprisingly quiet. It is audible, but it's way quieter than my PlayStation 2, that's for sure. So here's the main menu of the Xbox. Pretty simple by today's standards, but hey, back in 2001, this is really all you really needed. So we've got 4 options. We've got memory, music, Xbox Live, and settings. Memory is where we manage our saved data either on the Xbox hard drive or on the memory unit. As you may be able to tell by the available blocks that we have left on the hard drive, you can fit a lot of data on the Xbox hard drive, surprisingly. Music is where we listen to audio CDs on the Xbox, and one really cool feature is you can actually rip your CDs straight to the Xbox hard drive and listen to them that way, which is awesome. What's even better is that some games support custom soundtracks, which allow you to replace the in-game music and use the music that you have stored on your hard drive, which is so cool. That is a feature I would love to show off, but all the music that I have on my Xbox is copyrighted, so I don't think we're going to do that, unfortunately. Xbox Live is where we can manage our Xbox Live account as well as create a new account. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, this submenu is completely useless nowadays because Microsoft shut down Xbox Live on the original Xbox back in 2010. So there is no way to experience this anymore, unfortunately. And finally, we have settings where we can manage various things such as date and time, language, audio, video, network settings, auto sign-in, parental controls, auto shut-off, and system info. One cool but at the same time kind of creepy part about the Xbox dashboard is the various ambient noises that you hear. I'll turn up the volume just so you can listen to them. No, it doesn't mean that my Xbox is haunted, but those noises that you just heard were actually taken from public domain audio from NASA transmissions from the Apollo days. Yeah, crazy, right? Those various audio files were mixed together to make the Xbox feel like it was alien technology, something that was out of this world, which honestly, that's pretty freaking cool. But also kind of creepy when you think about it. I'm sure there's been people out there that have fallen asleep with their Xbox on and heard these noises and thought that their Xbox was haunted. I mean, I can't really blame them. The analog sticks on the Xbox are surprisingly responsive. As you can see, if I just barely press on the stick, my character instantly responds, which is always a good thing. There's a very slight amount of dead zone, but really it's not all that noticeable. The controller also has surprisingly good rumble, so if I shoot a vehicle here, there's definitely some oomph behind it. It's nowhere near as violent as the PS2 controller, but it comes very, very close. Here, let me put the controller down so you can actually listen to it. I know that probably wasn't a good example, but it's not very easy to explain it without actually experiencing it, but take my word for it, it's got some good rumble. The face buttons feel alright. Like, don't get me wrong, they're not the worst face buttons in the world, but they're just a tiny bit too clunky for my liking. They are decently responsive for the most part, but there are times that it feels like you gotta use some extra force to actually get it to register. I'm not entirely sure if that has something to do with the age of my controller or if that's just a widespread issue with the Xbox controller. I'm not entirely sure. But luckily it doesn't seem to affect the black and white buttons nor the start and back buttons, so that's good. One thing that I really like about the Xbox controller, and it's something that I did mention in my PS2 review, is that unlike the PS2 controller, the Xbox controller has real triggers, and they feel surprisingly responsive. It makes playing racing games like Outrun 2 way, way better. There is one minor issue that I have about the triggers on the Xbox controller, and it's something that they did fix on the Xbox 360. It's that the triggers feel a little stiff at times, and it tends to hurt my fingers after a while. But, you know, it's only a minor issue, and it doesn't really bother me all that much. Let's talk about the D-pad by showing off a game like Marble Madness here. And, well, it's not the worst D-pad I've ever used, and it's a hell of a lot better than the Xbox 360 D-pad, that's for sure. But it suffers from the same problem as the Xbox 360 controller, in that it's basically like a rotating D-pad, where it's just one piece rotating over an axis, and it just doesn't feel quite right. Don't get me wrong, it works well enough, but you have to be really direct with your movement sometimes, otherwise, say for example, if you want to go right, you'll start going upper right or bottom right instead. It's kind of annoying, but hey, at least it's a lot better than the Xbox 360 D-pad. That's for sure. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, the Xbox supports high definition video outputs all the way up to 1080i. Virtual Pool here is running at 720p, and I'm not entirely sure how well this is going to pick up on camera, but in person it actually looks pretty good on an HD TV. It's not quite as sharp as an HDMI output, but it's still pretty damn good. If you have an HD television, the Xbox cleans up surprisingly well. I do recommend getting one of those HDMI adapters just to make it more convenient, because I know that newer TVs are starting to phase out component connectors, unfortunately. But luckily, HDMI adapters seem to be pretty common for the Xbox, as far as I know. And so, that was the Microsoft Xbox. A lot of people thought Microsoft making their very own console was an insane idea, and one that probably wasn't going to work. But considering where the brand is today, well, they proved them wrong. While yes, the Xbox didn't beat the PS2 in terms of sales, it was still a fantastic console, and one that made huge innovations in the industry. It was the first console to have a built-in hard drive. It brought broadband online gaming to the masses. And of course, thanks to its PC architecture, it made porting games from PC to console much, much easier. Because of that and its sheer graphical horsepower, the Xbox got near impossible PC ports like Chronicles of Riddick, Tron 2.0, Counter-Strike, and hell, even freaking Half-Life 2. That's right. They somehow got Half-Life 2 running on the Xbox. That is just mind-blowing. If you want the best possible versions of 6th generation games, the Xbox is the way to go. by far. And of course, it's got some pretty great exclusives. The console, as well as the games, are still fairly cheap nowadays. And considering the Xbox is going on to 20 years old as of recording this video, it's the perfect time to pick one up. Even though the Xbox 360, Xbox One, and Xbox Series X and S are all backwards compatible with Xbox games, they're not compatible with all Xbox games. So if you want to play the entirety of the Xbox library, the only way to do that is to play them on the original Xbox. There is one thing to be aware of though. If you're going to pick up an original Xbox, there is one thing that you should take into account, and that's the infamous clock capacitor. Unlike most consoles which use either a coin cell battery or a ROM chip, for some odd reason Microsoft decided to use a frickin' capacitor to keep the Xbox's date and time settings. Now that's fine and all, but over time those capacitors can go bad. And when they do, it can be pretty catastrophic because they will explode and leak all over the motherboard and ruin the console. The only way you can prevent this is if you desolder the clock capacitor before it explodes. I unfortunately have not done that on my Xbox yet, so until I do, this thing is basically a ticking time bomb. So to sum it up, just keep that in mind if you're going to pick up an Xbox. So I think we're done here. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. On the top of the console, we have this Xbox logo right in the center, really nice touch, as well as a gigantic X. Aw, the battery's dead. Oh well. So here's the main menu of the Xbox. Pretty simple, but oh my god, seriously?